The autumn of 1897 painted Millbrook Valley in shades of amber and rust, but no beauty could mask the ugliness that had taken root in its heart. Sarah McKenna stood at the edge of the town square, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, the coarse fabric doing little to shield her from the October wind or the stares that followed her everywhere. "There she goes again," Mrs. Henley whispered to her companion, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "Poor thing don't know when she ain't wanted." Sarah's fingers unconsciously traced the scarred tissue that covered the left side of her face. A twisted landscape of pink and white that told the story of that terrible night 6 months ago. The fire had taken everything: her family's bakery, her parents, her younger brother Tommy, and the face that had once made young men tip their hats and stumble over their words. The flames had spared her life but stolen her future. She moved through the square like a ghost, her boots clicking against the wooden planks as merchants and townsfolk turned away. Children pointed until their mothers yanked their hands down, scolding them in harsh whispers. The lucky ones simply pretended not to see her at all. "Sarah McKenna." The voice cut through the morning air like a whip crack. Sheriff Donovan approached, his badge catching the pale sunlight. "Mrs. Patterson says you were lurking around her store again yesterday evening." "I wasn't lurking," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was hoping to find work." "Work?" The sheriff let out a harsh laugh that made several onlookers turn. "Who's gonna hire someone like you? You bring nothing but bad luck wherever you go." The crowd began to gather, drawn by the promise of spectacle. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the same panic that had gripped her every day since the fire. In Millbrook Valley she had become less than human, a walking reminder of misfortune, a cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about vanity and sin. "Please," she whispered, backing away. "I just need what?" Mrs. Patterson emerged from the growing crowd, her face twisted with disgust. "You need to accept what you are, girl. The Lord marked you for a reason. Maybe if you'd been in church that night instead of dancing at the harvest social, your family would still be breathing." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. The harvest social, where she'd worn her best yellow dress and let Johnny Morrison spin her around the floor while her parents worked late at the bakery. Where she'd laughed and flirted instead of helping her family close up for the night. The guilt had eaten at her for months, a constant companion more faithful than any friend. "That's enough." The voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. The crowd parted as a tall figure stepped forward. Thomas Callahan, the rancher who lived 10 miles outside town. Sarah had seen him before, always alone, always silent, conducting his business with few words and fewer smiles. "This ain't your concern, Callahan," Sheriff Donovan said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. Thomas stepped closer to Sarah, his weathered face impassive. He was perhaps 40 years old, with graying hair and hands calloused from years of ranch work. His eyes, a deep brown like rich soil, settled on Sarah's face without flinching, without the revulsion she'd grown accustomed to seeing. "Miss McKenna," he said, his voice carrying a slight Irish accent softened by years in America. "Would you like to come work for me?" The square fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sarah stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Work?" she managed to whisper. "I need help with cooking, cleaning, tending to the animals. It's honest work for honest pay. You'd have your own room, 3 meals a day, and no one to bother you." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. "Thomas Callahan, you can't be serious. That girl is cursed. The fire followed her out of that bakery. It'll follow her to your ranch too." Thomas turned his steady gaze to the older woman. "The only curse I see is the ugliness in people's hearts. Miss McKenna survived something terrible. That makes her strong, not cursed. You'll regret this," Sheriff Donovan warned. "Mark my words, Callahan. Nothing good comes from harboring the marked ones." Thomas extended his arm to Sarah, and she stared at it as if it were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Around them, the crowd murmured with disapproval and disbelief. Some crossed themselves, others shook their heads in pity, Not for Sarah, but for the man foolish enough to take her in. "The choice is yours, Miss McKenna," Thomas said quietly. "But if you come with me, no one will call you cursed in my house." Sarah looked around the square one last time, at the faces filled with hatred and disgust, at the place that had been her home but now felt like a prison. Then she placed her trembling hand on Thomas's arm. "I'll come," she whispered. As they walked toward his wagon, Sarah heard Mrs. Patterson's voice rise above the murmurs. "You'll see, Thomas Callahan. The curse will take you too. Mark my words." But Sarah didn't look back. For the first time in 6 months, someone had called her strong instead of cursed. As the wagon pulled away from Millbrook Valley, she dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, her life wasn't over after all. The ranch stretched out before them like a promise. Wide open spaces where a woman's scars might mean less than her willingness. To work, where the only judgment came from the sky above and the earth below. Behind them, the town of Millbrook Valley grew smaller, its whispers fading into the wind. The Callahan Ranch sprawled across the valley floor like something from a dream. Sarah had forgotten she could have. Rolling pastures stretched toward distant mountains, dotted with cattle that moved like slow-moving clouds across the grassland. The main house, built from local timber and stone, sat nestled against a grove of oak trees that blazed gold and crimson in the autumn light. Thomas drove the wagon in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks, the creek that never ran dry, the boundary markers, the barn where his prized horses sheltered. Sarah clutched her small bundle of belongings, everything she owned in the world, and tried to process the reality of her situation. "That's where you'll be staying," Thomas said, gesturing toward a small cabin about 100 yards from the main house. "It was built for my foreman, but he moved on last spring. It's got a good stove, sturdy roof, and plenty of privacy." Privacy. The word sounded foreign to Sarah's ears. In town, privacy meant hiding, meant shame. Here, it sounded like freedom. He says cabin was simple but well-maintained, with one large room that served as living space and bedroom, plus a smaller alcove for cooking. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and large windows let in the afternoon light. It was more space than Sarah had ever had to herself, and infinitely cleaner than the cramped boarding house room she'd been renting with her dwindling savings. "I'll pay you $12 a month," Thomas said as he helped her down from the wagon. "That's fair wages for fair work. You'll take your meals with me in the main house. I'm tired of my own cooking, and I suspect you are too." Sarah nodded, still struggling to find her voice. The generosity felt overwhelming after months of scraping by on charity and odd jobs that paid pennies. "Why?" she finally managed to ask. Thomas paused in the act of unloading her bundle. "Why? What? Why are you helping me? You don't know me, and the town, they'll turn against you for this." He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on the distant mountains. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. "I lost my wife 3 years ago. Consumption. For months before she died, people would cross the street rather than risk catching it from her. They treated her like she was already dead, like her sickness made her less human." He turned to look at Sarah directly. "I know what it's like to watch someone suffer, not just from their affliction, but from the cruelty of people who should show compassion." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first tears she'd shed in weeks that weren't born of despair. "I'm not asking for gratitude," Thomas continued. "I'm asking for good work. Can you give me that?" "Yes," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "Yes, I can." The next few days fell into a rhythm that Sarah had almost forgotten was possible. She woke before dawn to tend the chickens and gather eggs, then prepared breakfast for herself and Thomas. He was a man of few words, but his silences were comfortable rather than oppressive. He thanked her for each meal, complimented her biscuits, and never once stared at her scars. In the afternoons, she cleaned the main house, a large, comfortable space that bore the feminine touches of Thomas's late wife. Photographs showed a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her presence lingered in the carefully tended garden, the hand-stitched curtains, the books of poetry on the mantelpiece. Her name was Catherine, Thomas said one evening, as Sarah served him dinner. He'd noticed her looking at a photograph of his wife holding a baby. We lost the child in birth, and Catherine never recovered her full strength after that. She was beautiful, Sarah said softly. By the end of the first week, Sarah began to believe she might actually have a future here. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time since the fire, she fell asleep each night exhausted from honest labor rather than emotional torment. It was on a Saturday morning, as she hung laundry on the line behind her cabin, that the first sign of trouble appeared. A rider approached at a gallop, dust trailing behind his horse like a banner of urgency. Sarah recognized him as Pete Williams, one of the younger men from town. He pulled up short when he saw her, his face twisting with disgust. "Where's Callahan?" he demanded. "In the north pasture, checking the fences," Sarah replied, stepping back, instinctively. Pete's eyes swept over her with undisguised revulsion. "You got some nerve showing your face out here where decent folk might see it." Before Sarah could respond, Thomas appeared from around the barn, having heard the commotion. His expression darkened when he saw Pete's aggressive posture. "Williams," Thomas said curtly. "State your business." "My business is with you, Callahan. The whole town's talking about what you done, taking in that marked woman. Folks are saying you've lost your mind, bringing a curse down on the whole valley." Thomas stepped closer to Pete, his hand resting casually on the fence post where he kept a rifle for coyotes. "And what folks are saying this?" "Sheriff Donovan, Mrs. Patterson, the preacher, hell, everyone with sense. They sent me out here to give you a chance to come to your senses before things get ugly. Is that a threat, Williams?" Pete's horse danced nervously, picking up on the tension. "It's a warning, Callahan. Send her away before something bad happens. We all know what that fire took from the town. Good people, honest people. And she walked away without a scratch on her soul, just marks on her face to remind us what she is." Sarah felt the familiar shame rising in her throat. But then she saw Thomas's expression. Not anger, but something colder and more dangerous. "Get off my land," Thomas said quietly. "And if you or anyone else from town sets foot on my property, to threaten my employee again, you'll find out what I learned about dealing with troublemakers during my time in the cavalry." Pete's face flushed, but he backed his horse up. "You're making a mistake, Callahan. A big one. Don't say we didn't. Warn you." As the rider galloped away, Sarah felt the fragile peace of the past week shatter around her. She'd been foolish to think she could escape the town's hatred. Foolish to believe she deserved this sanctuary. "I should go," she said quietly. "I don't want to bring trouble to your ranch." Thomas turned to her, his brown eyes steady and determined. "This is your home now, Sarah, and no small-minded fools are going to drive you away from it, not while I draw breath." The conviction in his voice made her believe him, but as she watched Pete Williams disappear over the ridge, Sarah knew that their troubles were just beginning. The trouble started small, as it always did in places like Millbrook Valley. First came the canceled contracts. Ranchers who had done business with Thomas for years suddenly finding other suppliers for their grain and livestock. Then the subtle social exclusions. Thomas was no longer welcome at the Saturday night gatherings. At Henderson's store, his usual seat at Sunday service remained empty by unspoken agreement, and conversations stopped when he entered the post office. Sarah noticed the changes before Thomas mentioned them. She saw how he lingered over his morning coffee, reading and rereading letters that bore increasingly formal language from former friends. She watched him count and recount the money in his strong box, calculating how long they could survive on their savings if the isolation continued. "Perhaps I should look for work elsewhere," Sarah suggested one evening as she served him dinner. 2 weeks had passed since Pete Williams's visit, and the pressure was building like storm clouds on the horizon. Thomas looked up from his untouched plate. "Is that what you want?" Sarah hesitated. The truth was complicated. She had found something, here she'd never expected, not just work and shelter, but a kind of peace. Thomas treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with pity, and everything to do with genuine regard for her abilities. He asked her opinion on ranch matters, listened when she suggested improvements to the household routine, and never once made her feel like a burden or an object of charity. "What I want doesn't matter," she said finally. What matters is that your life was good before I came, and now I'm learning who my real friends are. Thomas finished. That's not your fault, Sarah, that's theirs. 3 days later, their isolation took a more sinister turn. Sarah was returning from the creek with water buckets when she saw the smoke rising from the direction of the north pasture. Her blood ran cold. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant everything. She'd lost. Everything she'd failed to save. She dropped the buckets and ran toward the main house, calling for Thomas. He emerged from the barn at a run, having seen the smoke as well. They saddled horses quickly and rode hard toward the source of the blaze. What they found made Thomas's jaw clench with barely controlled rage. Someone had set fire to a section of his fence line, and the flames were spreading toward a grove of young trees he'd planted in Catherine's memory. But worse than the damage was the message, painted in crude letters on a boulder near the fire. "Send the witch away." They managed to contain the blaze before it reached the grove, but the message was clear. The town's patience was running out. "This has to stop," Sarah said that evening as they sat on Thomas's front porch, watching the sun set over the valley. Her hands shook as she sipped her coffee, the acrid smell of smoke still clinging to her clothes. "It will stop," Thomas replied, his voice grim. "When I find out who did this." "And then what? You'll fight the whole town?" "Thomas, be reasonable. I can disappear. I've done it before." He turned to look at her, and in the lamplight she could see the determination in his face. "Catherine used to say that evil only wins when good people do nothing. I won't let them drive you away with their ignorance and cruelty." That night, Sarah lay awake in her cabin, staring at the ceiling and listening to the wind rattle the windows. She thought about the life she'd built here in just a few short weeks, the satisfaction of work well done, the pleasure of cooking for someone who appreciated her efforts, the simple joy of watching sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. It was the first time since the fire that she'd felt truly alive. But she also thought about Thomas, about the respect he'd built over years of honest dealing, about the future he was risking for a woman the world had written off as cursed. The guilt that had never fully left her since the night her family died came rushing back, sharp and bitter as winter wind. The next morning brought Sheriff Donovan and 2 deputies to the ranch. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the horses approach. Through the window, she watched Thomas step out onto the porch, his posture alert but not welcoming. "Callahan," the sheriff said, dismounting slowly. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About the McKenna girl. There've been incidents in town. Strange accidents, bad luck following folks around. People are getting spooked." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She moved closer to the window, straining to hear. "What kind of accidents?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Miller's horse threw him yesterday for no reason. Broke his arm. Mrs. Patterson's chickens all died overnight. No sign of disease. Young Billy Henderson fell into the creek and nearly drowned, and he's been swimming that creek since he was knee-high to a grasshopper." The sheriff paused significantly. "All these things happened to people who've spoken out against that girl being here. So you're here to arrest her for what? Causing bad luck? I'm here to suggest that maybe she'd be happier somewhere else, somewhere far away from Millbrook Valley, for everyone's sake." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Sarah held her breath, waiting for his response. "Sheriff," Thomas finally said, "I've known you for 8 years. You're not a superstitious man. You don't believe Sarah McKenna is causing these accidents any more than I do." Sheriff Donovan shifted uncomfortably. "What I believe don't matter. What matters is keeping the peace. And right now, that girl is a threat to the peace. The only threat to the peace is people who would rather blame a grieving woman for their troubles than take responsibility for their own lives." The sheriff's voice hardened. "I'm trying to help you here, Callahan, but if you won't listen to reason, I can't protect you from what's coming." "What's coming?" "People are scared. Scared people do stupid things. I'd hate to see this get out of hand." After the sheriff left, Thomas found Sarah in the kitchen, her face pale as fresh snow. She hadn't touched her breakfast, and her hands trembled as she poured coffee she didn't want. "You heard," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. They won't stop, will they? Not until I'm gone. Or dead. Thomas sat down across from her, his weathered hands folded on the table. Sarah, look at me. Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. I want you to know something, he said quietly. These past weeks having you here, it's the first time since Catherine died that this place has felt like a home, instead of just a house. You've brought life back to this ranch, back to me. Whatever happens, I want you to know that. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. On the scarred side, they followed the raised patterns of tissue like rivers following ancient channels. But if staying means putting you in danger, then we face that danger together. Thomas interrupted. Because that's what people do when they care about each other. They stand together. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain. Sarah looked out at the valley that had become her sanctuary and wondered if she would be strong enough to fight for it when the time came. She was about to find out. The storm that had been building finally broke on a Saturday night in late October. Sarah woke to the sound of thunder and something else, the pounding of hooves approaching fast through the rain. She pulled on her wrapper and peered out the cabin window, her heart sinking as she counted the torches moving through the darkness like angry stars. At least 20 riders surrounded the ranch, their voices carrying on the wind despite the storm. She could make out Sheriff Donovan's voice trying to maintain order, but underneath his words ran a current of mob fury that made her blood run cold. Sarah grabbed her boots and ran through the rain to the main house, not bothering to knock as she burst through the kitchen door. Thomas was already there, loading his rifle with grim efficiency. How many? He asked without looking up. 20, maybe more. Thomas, you can't fight them all. He finished loading and checked the chambers on his pistol. I'm not planning to fight them. I'm planning to make them think twice about what they're doing. This is madness. Just let me go with them. Let me... No. The word came out like a gunshot. Thomas finally looked at her and his eyes were blazing with something fierce and protective. I told you once, no one calls you cursed in my house. That extends to my land, my property, and anywhere I draw breath. The voices outside grew louder. Sarah could make out individual shouts now. Send her out. We know you're in there, witch. Callahan, don't make this harder than it has to be. Thomas moved to the front window and called out. That's far enough. State your business, Sheriff Donovan rode closer, his horse skittish in the storm. Thomas, you know why we're here. Just send the girl out and this can end peacefully. The girl has a name. It's Sarah McKenna, and she's done nothing wrong. She's cursed. Mrs. Patterson's shrill voice cut through the rain. She's brought nothing but misfortune to this valley. The only misfortune I see is grown people acting like children afraid of shadows. A new voice spoke up, Pastor Reynolds from the Methodist Church. Thomas, as a Christian man, you must see that some things are beyond our understanding. This woman survived a fire that took her entire family. That's not natural. That's not God's will for the innocent. Sarah felt the words like physical blows. Even the preacher, even a man of God, believed she was somehow responsible for her family's death. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held ready but not aimed. The rain plastered his hair to his head and soaked through his shirt, but he stood straight and unbending. Pastor Reynolds, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the storm. I'm surprised to see you here. Does your God not teach forgiveness, compassion for those who suffer? God also teaches us to be wise, Thomas, to recognize evil when we see it. Then look in the mirror. Thomas's voice cracked like thunder. Look at yourselves, 20 armed, men in the night, coming to terrorize a woman who's never lifted a hand against any of you. If you want to see evil, look at what you're doing right now. Sarah watched from the window as the crowd shifted restlessly. Some of the men looked uncomfortable, but others, led by Mrs. Patterson and a few of the younger hotheads, remained resolute. We gave you chances, Callahan, called out Jake Morrison, Johnny's older brother. Sarah recognized the family resemblance and the hatred in his voice. You wouldn't listen. Now we're done asking nicely. What are you going to do, Jake? Burn down my house? Shoot an unarmed woman? Is that the kind of man you are? I'm the kind of man who protects his community from threats. The only threat here is your ignorance." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Sarah could feel the moment balancing on the knife's edge between reason and violence. She made her decision. Before Thomas could stop her, she stepped out onto the porch beside him. The crowd reacted immediately. Some horses shied, men crossed themselves, and more than one rifle swung in her direction. "Stop!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the rain. "Please, just stop." The crowd fell silent except for the drumming of rain on the roof and the restless movement of horses. Sarah stepped forward, and Thomas moved to block her path, but she placed her hand on his arm. "It's all right," she said quietly. Then louder to the crowd, "You want to know about the fire? You want to know why I lived and my family died?" "Sarah, don't," Thomas warned. But she was past caring about self-preservation. These people had taken everything from her, her home, her reputation, her peace. The least she could do was give them the truth they claimed to want. "I lived because I was selfish," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I was at the harvest dance while my parents and brother worked late at the bakery. I was dancing and laughing and flirting while they were trapped in a building that caught fire. I lived because I wasn't where I should have been, with my family, helping them, protecting them." The crowd was utterly still now, hanging on her words. "You call me cursed, but you're wrong. I'm not cursed, I'm guilty. Guilty of being young and foolish and selfish. Guilty of surviving when better people died. But guilt isn't the same as evil, and suffering isn't the same as sin." Sarah pulled back her shawl, letting the torchlight fully illuminate her scarred face. Several people gasped, but she didn't flinch. "You think these scars mark me as cursed? These scars mark me as someone who ran into a burning building trying to save her family, even though it was too late. These scars mark me as someone who would rather die than live with the knowledge that she didn't try." Mrs. Patterson's voice broke the silence. "Pretty words won't change what you are." "And what am I?" Sarah challenged. "Tell me, Mrs. Patterson, what exactly am I?" You're... The older woman faltered, perhaps hearing her own words for the first time. "I'm a woman who lost everything and was offered kindness by a good man. I'm someone who works hard, hurts no one, and asks only to be left in peace. If that makes me a witch, then your definitions need examining." Pastor Reynolds urged his horse forward. "Child, we don't want to hurt you, but the signs..." "What signs?" Thomas spoke up. "Bad luck? Accidents? Do you know what I call those?" "Life. Life happens, Pastor. People get thrown by horses, chickens die of disease, children fall in creeks. It happened before Sarah came here, and it'll happen after we're all gone." Sheriff Donovan cleared his throat. "Thomas, be reasonable. Even if you're right, the town won't have peace while she's here. People are afraid." "Then the people need to learn courage," Thomas replied. "I'm not sending Sarah away because you're all too cowardly to face your own fears." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a feeling she barely remembered from before the fire. Someone was fighting for her, standing with her against the world's judgment, but the warmth was short-lived. Jake Morrison raised, his rifle pointing it directly at Sarah's heart. "Enough talk," he snarled. "She goes tonight one way or another." Thomas stepped in front of Sarah, his own rifle coming up in a smooth motion. "The first man who threatens her answers to me. Then you'll die too," Jake said simply. The rain continued to fall, washing away the last pretense of civilization. Sarah could see it in the faces around her. They had moved beyond reason into something darker, more primitive. Fear had transformed neighbors into enemies, Christians into a mob. But then, unexpectedly, a new voice spoke from the back of the crowd. "Jake Morrison, you put that rifle down this instant." An elderly woman rode forward on an old mare, her white hair streaming in the wind. Sarah recognized her as Mrs. Whitmore, the town's oldest resident and Jake's grandmother. "Grandma, you shouldn't be here," Jake said, but his rifle wavered. "I shouldn't be here. Boy, I shouldn't be anywhere near a grandson who'd point a gun at an unarmed woman in the middle of a storm." She rode directly between Jake and Sarah, her ancient eyes blazing with fury. What would your mother say if she could see you now? She'd say I was protecting the town. She'd say you were acting like a damn fool. Mrs. Whitmore turned to face the crowd. I've lived in this valley for 73 years. I've seen droughts and floods, good times and bad. And in all that time, I've never seen anything as shameful as this. She pointed a gnarled finger at Sarah. That girl there? She lost everything in a fire that could have happened to anyone. Lightning struck, wood burned, people died. It's tragic, but it's not magic. It's not a curse. It's just the kind of heartbreak that visits every community sooner or later. But the accidents, someone called out, are coincidences. Miller's been riding drunk for years. It's a wonder he didn't break his neck sooner. Patterson's chickens died because she's too cheap to buy proper feed. And Billy Henderson fell in the creek because he was showing off for Sally Jenkins, same as boys have been doing since time began. Mrs. Whitmore's words seemed to break a spell. Sarah could see doubt creeping into faces that had been set with certainty just moments before. Now I want you all to think, Mrs. Whitmore continued. Think hard about what you're doing here. You're terrorizing a woman who suffered more than any of us can imagine. And you're threatening a good man whose only crime is showing Christian charity. Is this who you want to be? Is this the town you want to live in? The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of rain and the occasional snort from a horse. Sarah held her breath, watching faces in the torchlight, seeing the struggle between fear and conscience play out in real time. Finally, Sheriff Donovan spoke. All right, folks, let's go home. This has gone far enough. No, Mrs. Patterson's voice cracked with desperation. You're all fools. You'll see. The curse will take us all. But the spell was broken. One by one, the riders began to turn away, embarrassed by what they'd almost done. Some wouldn't meet Sarah's eyes, others nodded apologetically to Thomas. Jake Morrison was the last to leave, his rifle still ready, his face twisted with frustrated rage. This isn't over, he promised. Curse or no curse, some things can't be allowed to stand. After the crowd dispersed, Sarah and Thomas stood on the porch in the rain, neither speaking for a long moment. Finally, Thomas set down his rifle and turned to her. You didn't have to do that, he said. You didn't have to expose yourself like that. Sarah wiped rain from her face, her fingers tracing the familiar landscape of her scars. Yes, I did. I'm tired of hiding, tired of being ashamed. If I'm going to live here, I want to live honestly. And do you? Want to live here? She looked out over the valley. Her valley now, she realized. Despite everything, despite the hatred and fear, this place had become home in a way nowhere had been since the fire. Yes, she said simply. I want to live here, with you. Thomas smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the troubles began. Then that's what we'll do, whatever comes. As they went inside to dry off and warm, up by the fire, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope of survival, but the deeper hope of belonging. The town might never fully accept her, but she had found her place anyway, and sometimes that was enough. The storm raged on outside, but inside the ranch house, two people, who had both known loss and loneliness, sat by the fire and began to plan their future together. It wouldn't be easy. Sarah knew Jake Morrison's threat wasn't empty, and the town's fear wouldn't disappear overnight. But for the first time since the fire took everything, Sarah McKenna felt truly blessed. Not cursed, not marked, not condemned, but blessed with the chance to build something new from the ashes of her old life. The fire had taken her family, her face, her innocence. But it hadn't taken her courage, her capacity for love, or her ability to hope. And in the end, perhaps that was enough to build a life upon.